Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session, New Multi-Faith Collaborations in Impact Investing. I'm Rabbi Siegel, JLens Director of Engagement. A few housekeeping announcements. The Jewish Impact Investing Summit will run 12 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, both today and tomorrow. The summit for tomorrow has a separate link that you should have received in your email. If you have any trouble tomorrow accessing the summit, please email me at rabbisiegel@jlensnetwork.org. The sessions will end 10 minutes before the hour to offer a short break, and we will be recording the content of the summit in order to make it available after the summit online. We welcome your questions during the sessions. Please, if you have a question, type it into the Q&A box on Zoom. So I am very excited about this panel. Impact investing is really a key arena for multi-faith collaboration. We're actually going to begin by talking about religious texts. Each of our panelists will share a text from their faith tradition and tell us a bit more about how that informs their investments. So we'll start with John O'Shaughnessy, who is founder of the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative. John also serves as CEO and CFO for the Franciscan Sisters of Mary. John, welcome, and could you just read this first text for us?
Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for having me. Just delighted with the first session. Thank you for that. Once more, we need to reject a magical conception of the market, which would suggest that problems can be solved simply by an increase in the profits of companies or individuals. Is it realistic to hope that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they will leave behind for future generations? Where profits alone count, there can be no thinking about the rhythms of nature, its phases of decay and regeneration, or the complexity of ecosystems which may be gravely upset by human intervention.
Thank you very much, John. And so this text from Pope Francis really talks about how the ultimate goal of life can't just be profit. Could you say that this informs a Catholic approach to impact investing, in that investing can't just be about financial return?
Sure, absolutely. I think it's crystal clear when you read this that is the message, that it cannot be all about maximizing returns. And that's truly how much of Catholic doctrine addresses this. If you look at what the church has laid out in the way of investment guidance for Catholic investors, they talk, and I heard this on an earlier session, the side about do no harm, as well as some guidance around how to do good. But frankly, it's the doing no harm part is quite a bit easier to lay out. So that's sort of how things have been tilted by and large. I think because, to say what the don'ts are, don't do this, don't invest in companies that are counter to Catholic social teaching, like producers of abortifacients or contraceptives or pornography. What Pope Francis has really begun to do is shift the conversation to how to do the good side. If you look at Laudato Si, he's laying out a vision for a new economy. An economy that is regenerative instead of extractive, one that's inclusive and equitable rather than exclusive and many times exploitive. So, and impact investing fits in this very importantly, very nicely. In fact, if you look at Pope Francis, he's been a leader in helping advance impact investing in the church. The first Vatican Impact Investing Conference took place in 2014. It was a gathering of people to come and talk about this very subject of impact investing and how does this work with social Catholic teaching and how can it be advanced. Then there was a follow-up one in 2016 and 2018, moving towards how do we actually do this, which I think is what the JLens is moving towards as well. And so what we got is the head of the church, Pope, who is helping put impact investing on the map for Catholics and doing it both in word and action.
Good. So, John, thank you. There are a couple of things I want to pull out from what you said. One is, those the Vatican Impact Investing conferences. JLens was delighted to get to be a part of a couple of those as part of the multi-faith gatherings present at those, and it was very inspiring, actually, for the first Jewish Impact Investing Summit that JLens hosted back in 2017. So, a huge thank you to the Vatican for that. The other thing I want to pull out as we also transition to our next panelist is the idea that sort of transitioning from the negative approach or the what to avoid approach to how can I actually make a positive impact with my investment capital, or with the capital entrusted to me. So I'd like to turn to Kavi Chawla. Kavi is a partner at Baton Global, working with financial services institutions with a specialty in Islamic finance. Kavi, I invite you to read this text.
O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even though it may be against yourselves or your parents or your kin. Be rich or poor, Allah is better protector to both than you. So do not follow lusts of your hearts, lest you may avoid justice. And if you distort your witness or refuse to give it verily, Allah is ever well acquainted with what you do.
Thank you, Kavi. So how does this text and other texts that you've shared with me about the Islamic concept of trusteeship, how does that inform Islam's approach to investing?
Yeah, so thanks, Rabbi Siegel. First of all, wonderful to be here and appreciate you putting this together. Again, as this text shows and others, there's this concept in Islam called of Khalifa, which essentially means everything that we are bestowed, be it life, be it our own human efforts, be it property and financial wealth, is to be utilized for the good of Allah. And so from there, you get that concept of not only trusteeship, but it goes one step further. And again, this is embedded in the Maqasid al-Sharia, which are the objectives of Sharia. And it goes one step further that beyond trusteeship, there's also this concept of justice, which means first and foremost, partly as you touched on a little earlier, and as John touched on before and the previous speaker in the first panel, I think Charlene, this concept of do no harm. Again, that is embedded in here. But there is also a concept layered on top of that do no harm, which is, again, all these resources or assets that were given should also be used to benefit everyone. By everyone here, again, we're talking about should benefit religion, life, family, mind, and property. And that distills all the way down to the environment and community. So again, this has then been actualized in particular that concept, again, of protecting property in the Maqasid al-Sharia. We take that concept and expand it. So every financial or productive economic asset, as we think about it, again, first and foremost, should be utilized to do no harm. But also it is incumbent as a Khalifa to utilize that asset to produce value or benefit for others, and this includes the community, those in need, as well as the physical environment.
Okay, thank you very much, Kavi. Now, I'll share a text from Jewish tradition. This is from the Torah in Deuteronomy. When you have eaten your fill, you shall bless the Lord your God on the good land God has given you, lest you say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hands have made for me this great wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for God gives you the strength to gain wealth, to keep the covenant that God swore to your ancestors even today. So this text speaks to me as a rabbi. It says about investing that wealth is not the ultimate. Jewish tradition accepts the idea of pursuit of wealth. There's actually not a particular value placed in Jewish tradition on poverty, but pursuit of wealth needs to be balanced with a whole set of other obligations to other people, to the environment, and one's spiritual obligation to the Creator to live an ethical life. Finally, I'd like to introduce Nana Francois. Nana is the membership director of FaithInvest, a new multi-faith impact investing organization founded in 2017. And Nana, I invite you to read your text, which is specifically about multi-faith collaboration.
Taoism has a unique sense of value in that it judges affluence by the number of different species. If all things in the universe grow well, then a society is a community of affluence. If not, this kingdom is on the decline. This view encourages both government and people to take good care of nature.
Thank you, Nana. So how does this text inspire and inform your approach to multi-faith collaboration in investing?
Thank you, Rabbi Siegel, for this invitation just to talk a bit about multi-faith collaboration. I mean, FaithInvest is a multi-faith organization, and this text really points to the privilege of being able to work with many different organizations, faiths, organizations that are pulling together, really seeking to work towards common goals, but recognizing the richness of each tradition. And I think as a multi-faith organization, we are privileged to be able to work that way, to take the best out of many different traditions and really seek to further our goal, which is to grow the scale and impact of faith-consistent investing.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing those texts. And just to follow up, Nana, with that goal of growing faith-consistent investing and growing a network, can you share more about FaithInvest and how the organization began? You know, there was a unique convening that happened in 2017. How did that convening lead? What was the inspiration for the founding of FaithInvest?
Absolutely. So back in 2017, there was a convening of about 50 asset owners, fund managers, multilateral organizations, and faith leaders in Switzerland, all gathered together with a view that it was time to decide how to implement some of the decisions and commitments that had been made in the past. There was a common agreement that there's a real need to help organizations not only move their hearts and move their minds, but actually move their investment wallets towards actually investing in a very consistent manner. And that Zug meeting back in 2017 was really the birth of FaithInvest. From there, the concept was grown. We became an organization as a charity December 2019. And since then, we've really been on this path of working with the different faiths collectively to meet this challenge. And I think one of the things we've benefited from is our legacy before FaithInvest was born. Our CEO was Martin Palmer, who was honorary president of the Alliance of Religions and Conservation and has 20+ years involved with working with faiths and making commitments towards the environment and the broader good. So that was a great way to start our journey.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that because you've mentioned to me also, Nana, that multi-faith collaboration is a really powerful tool in, you know, for example, the humanitarian arena. It's been well tested in other arenas. So can you share maybe even a few examples of what multi-faith collaboration looks like in the impact investing arena?
I mean, you do raise the point that we discussed earlier. There's almost a history of multi-faith collaboration really effectively in the humanitarian arena. Everybody focuses on the goal, they focus on the problem, they work together, and actually things get achieved. And it's what we're really trying to do is to translate some of that effective working together into the arena of investment. And there are many different ways in which different faiths can collaborate together. There's something which I might call collaboration by echoing. One of the examples is the green entrepreneurship program that we're working on together with the Vatican Laudato Si. They have created something which helps communities to work together to look at their projects and make them more sustainable by seeing how they can transform their business models. Having started that with the Catholic community, we've also started something similar with the Hindu community in India, with the Muslim community in Indonesia, and with the Orthodox Christian community in Armenia, each of them echoing what is a very strong model, and in that way collaborating together to drive a greater good. Then there's also the traditional collaboration, which is all sitting together to work towards a common goal. And one example I would put is the work that we're trying to do in collaboration with the climate investment funds, which is overseen, governed by the World Bank, where they are really trying to see how can we get different faith groups, the power of the faiths, both the power of their beliefs and of their assets, and how can we use them to galvanize some of what needs to happen to move the environmental conversation and agenda forward. So again, different faiths coming together, a common goal, working to deliver on the greater good.
Thank you very much, Nana. And let's turn to John. John, you've been a leader in the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative and also the Catholic Impact Investing Pledge, which was launched less than a year ago. And in many ways, the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative is similar to JLens in that you're field building on impact investing within a particular faith community. So could you tell us a brief history of the collaborative and what led to the creation of the pledge?
Great, happy to. Like a lot of things, it started really small. It was 5.5 years ago. It's a time when impact investing was starting to grow, but the Catholic investment community was really not part of what was going on, certainly not very much. And so 10 people came together in St. Louis. Some traveled to St. Louis just to have dinner together and talk about this. They included some folks who were with Catholic institutional investors, and then some investment professionals that work with Catholic institutions and were very interested in the subject, had a passion for it. So what came out of that, the takeaway from that one night was, one is, okay, we've got this little community that started. And then two is, we're going to keep the conversation going. So we did. We had started regular conference calls. We'd share what was going on. We started to see a number of people starting to hear about it and want to join those calls. We had a follow-up gathering in St. Louis the year later. We had almost twice as many people then. We formed a steering committee. We started to branch out a bit. We had regional gatherings, and since then a couple in Boston, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and our first one outside the US in London last October. And then we've had started a website, sharing stories of groups, what they've been doing, how's it gone, what were the challenges, and webinars. The pledge is very key to all of what we're doing now. And just to give you a very brief idea of what it is, it's made up of two parts. One is principles. The principles outline why impact investing is important for Catholics. Number two are the commitments, action steps. So there, one in signing would commit to incorporate impact investments into their investment portfolios, but also be accountable for it. They would share progress on how that process has gone, and then also help commit to promoting awareness of impact investing among other fellow Catholics. And so the reason we did this, the reason we decided it was time to do this was, and it came together, the idea for it, 1.5 years ago. We've had our annual gathering in St. Louis every year with the most active participants. Did a lot of talking from the very beginning, moving forward to that date. And it just seemed like we had to take action. We wanted to galvanize sort of a call to action for groups to actually do this now and to get off the sidelines. And then as they would sign up and they would start to do this, we could raise them up, celebrate what they were doing, share the information about what they're doing in a way to inspire more of the same. And so fortunately that sort of happened. We've had, as you mentioned, we rolled it out in October when we were in London, and we had 6 anchor signers then. Since then, we've had another 16. And with the addition of some full-time staff now that are coming on this year at SEEK, and we call it SEEK for short, CIC for Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative, we think we're really going to make up a whole lot more ground in the number of signees, those who are committed.
Great, and I really appreciate you sharing that history and noting that from the outside it can look like it just sort of happened or your community jumped in, but actually from the inside you are noting that it really took a lot of work, and it took time, and it took gathering and meetings and connecting. And I also appreciate you noting that there's a lot of inspiring people by encouraging people to share their stories as a big part of SEEK. Just a follow-up question about the pledge. One of the things you've shared with me about that pledge, which is a really impressive commitment, and it's very impressive that the 6 initial and now 16 additional institutions have signed on. That wasn't easy. You had to navigate between some institutions who wanted the pledge to be more ambitious and others who wanted it to be more watered down. So how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so we knew it wouldn't be easy. We wanted to make it accessible but meaningful. And so where do you come down on that? We assembled just a terrific group of people that were all very active in SEEK and who were willing to take this on. So it included several from institutions, Catholic institutions, but also people from industry. And it was a process. It took several months, They would prepare a draft. We would share it among other SEEK participants, get feedback, share that with the committee, and then they go to work on it more. We had multiple iterations. We went through this, and when we thought we really came down with something that seemed right. And one indicator, as you say, we had one group thought it was too ambitious. It was a Jesuit university who said, you know, we don't know that we could sign this because we don't know if we could commit to impact investing. We will be willing to look at the possibility. So could you didn't say water down, could you limit it to making an effort to do this? We had another Catholic foundation that said, hey, this should be more like the B Corp. How about we have some sort of certification process, steps to do this? And we thought, no, that's just too prescriptive. And so we liked it when we found people on both sides that thought it's too tough or too easy. And we like how it's come out, and it's working well.
Great, thank you. So Kavi, let's talk about Islamic finance is going through a bit of an evolution, and some of that is driven by global trends that didn't necessarily originate within the Muslim community, including the growth of impact investing. So can you describe in a little more detail this evolution from haram and a kind of negative screen to conversations about leveraging assets for positive impact and what those look like right now?
Yeah, certainly. So I think in the last panel, maybe it was Catherine who said, you know, her last comments were, don't let perfect be enemy of the good, right? So when you kind of look at the historical evolution of, you know, impact investing within Islam, it started with that again, kind of, okay, how do we do no harm philosophy, right? And that probably until early 2005, et cetera, that was kind of the predominant philosophy, right? And then you started to see, as assets within the Islamic finance space in general started to grow, you started to see, and assets within the impact investment space started to grow, you started seeing more academic literature and more impact investing activity in broader financial markets. That sort of started to pivot that viewpoint of a lot of both investors, but also academic scholars within Islamic finance, as well as then Sharia advisors, to go beyond, again, just the do no harm to how do we add value and benefit. Now, that kind of trend of let's look at the impact space for opportunities has then been amplified by one demographic shift, which again is, if you look across the Muslim world, you know, 70+%, give or take, of the population is under 30. Right? They're very well connected on social media, and they access information very, very quickly. You could argue there has been a resurgence of a Muslim identity to some degree, particularly amongst youth. So from that perspective, there really is a genuine spiritual desire to tap into that, do good and create positive outcome with my assets. The second trend is probably augmented by when you look at regulators, when they've said, okay, there's similarities and overlaps between faith-based and perhaps non-faith-based, but still values-driven investing. There's an opportunity here from a financial sector perspective to start to crowd in additional AUM. So kind of the confluence of those two, but again, driven by that identity, is probably what's kind of started to mobilize Islamic investing, moving from negative screens towards a positive approach around value creation rather than prevention of negative impact.
Great, and I'd love to follow up with that, with the question of regulators, because I think it's something a little unique to the Muslim world. So just as an example, you work with the Bank of Malaysia and some other centralized financial authorities, and centralized authorities have in the past been a little hesitant to issue guidance around what in the field is known as environmental, social governance, ESG concerns. But they maybe have begun to see a need. Could you just talk a little bit more about what that looks like, how that translates into the regulator's picture?
Yeah, so I guess I'll break it up first by addressing the Sharia issue and then kind of the ESG or SRI issue. So from a Sharia issue, we do have multilateral standards boards, AOFI, which is accounting, or the Islamic Finance Standards Boards. And again, so they are some multilateral boards that, again, create standardization and try to drive harmonization. again, you need some similar standards to enable cross-border activity. So they're more practical evolutions, but they're not regulatory bodies. From a regulatory perspective, at the national level, within South Asia and Southeast Asia, you have tended to see, again, what is considered acceptable or Sharia compliant, or what is considered unacceptable or haram, tends to be regulated by, again, your financial regulator. In Malaysia, for instance, it would be the Securities Commission would have some passage, or you've got a nationally constituted body that under law says these products are acceptable and these products are excluded. Now, within the Middle East itself, however, you don't necessarily have national bodies created, and it's individual investors utilizing their own personal Sharia scholar or the fatwas of a scholar with whom they align, utilize those to determine by themselves what is acceptable of what is not. But again, it's generally not regulated. That again is, on one level, is tried to empower the individual or the believer to make their best decision. On the other hand, though, it does limit markets where, again, if you have diversity of what is an acceptable Sharia compliant product or what is not within a particular geography, building a shared market becomes more challenging. So we are seeing more trends towards standardization, harmonization, while being respectable diversity, again, to kind of grow the industry.
Thank you, Kavi. Nana, a follow-up question about multi-faith collaboration. It sounds great, but it's not very easy. Every faith group has some universal beliefs. For example, we all care about ending poverty, etc. But even as has become clear on this panel, different faith groups have particular approaches or particular issues that are of concern only to them. And sometimes those differ, sometimes sharply from each other. So how do you overcome the challenge of cultures, priorities, values, beliefs when navigating in a multi-faith setting? And maybe even if you have some examples of how you manage that.
Absolutely. So I think our approach is really to encourage collaboration where it makes sense. But the very first thing we do is to really recognize the richness in each individual faith tradition. So what we do when organizations come and join us is we start off by working through something that we call faith consistent investment guidelines. We go back to your beliefs, work through your beliefs to drive values, and use those values to really build and put a foundation behind the investment policies which you can use as a motivation for shifting the capital in the way that you intend to do it. And what we find that is by going through this process, you're really giving each faith tradition, each group a real acknowledgement that we are not trying to fit you into some jigsaw puzzle that we've created. We're starting from what is important to you, and then using that to identify where other faiths have similar ambitions, similar desires, similar needs, and putting those together. Because you're completely correct that it's not easy, even within the same faith. Sometimes it's not easy, let alone when you're trying to put different faiths together. So our approach is very much to start by recognizing the faiths themselves, but then also to recognize that, as you say, there are some common ambitions that we have, there's some common goals that we want to achieve. And sometimes even there's a surprise in the common ambition that's achieved. So I'll just give an example that wasn't even planned. In one of our first Asian conferences before FaithInvest, but in the time of ARC, we invited the Church of Sweden to go and present to that audience because they'd done particularly well in terms of helping individual parishes to follow faith consistent investment policies, starting kind of from the top and helping to roll down. And having presented that at an Asian conference, you found that the Muslim Union in Indonesia thought this is actually quite a good idea. There are things we can learn here. Almost without intervention, they collaborated, spoke together, learned, and found a way to do this multi-faith collaboration. It wasn't artificial, it wasn't forced. It was recognition that another faith has something to offer, another tradition has something to offer, and let's learn and use it where we can. That's very much our approach.
Great. Thank you, Nana. And I think that speaks just from JLens' experience also. I think that really speaks to the Jewish community. When we enter this space, we encounter some very clear shared values, and then we also encounter some unique concerns that are Jewish in nature. And JLens' Director of Advocacy, Rabbi Josh Ratner, will speak more to that, I think, tomorrow. But I'd like to turn to each of you with a question about the role of religious leaders, clergy, faith advisors, many of whom may not be coming from a financial background. So Kavi, I'll start with you if that's all right, but you mentioned the role of a Sharia advisor, and that in some parts of the Muslim world, that role is very significant as there's not the centralized regulation. So it's also, you also mentioned the resurgence of interest among young people, but it's also not something that young people can just make up or sort of, there is a faith tradition, there's a traditional way of interpreting texts. So how does that look in the Muslim world? How do Sharia advisors navigate that? What's the role of a personal Sharia advisor?
Yeah, and so I guess I'll speak more at first from perhaps a de jure perspective, right? So they're usually by contract, right? If an agreement is considered a Sharia compliant contract, then it does need the sign off of a Sharia scholar or a sheikh. And again, that title of scholar or sheikh implies that one has gone through scholarship and achieved a degree in Sharia, right? So it does require certain academic qualifications along with some, experience qualifications. Now, what that does is, again, it does start to create some consistency in value and quality, which is positive. On the downside, however, as you kind of alluded to, what that means, though, is because one has studied Sharia, it doesn't necessarily imply one has studied financial transactions or finance. So once you start to get to complex transactions, and again, this even starts to apply to impact investing, right? Is microfinance-like activity acceptable even from a zakat or a sadaqah or a donation perspective or not, right? As you start to get to financial transactions, then the knowledge of that Sharia scholar certainly becomes a bottleneck in the ability of investors to activate on perhaps what they believe are value-aligned investment opportunities. But there is, again, a perhaps jurisprudential roadblock given that Sharia scholar. So one of the efforts that we're seeing, again, is, again, especially amongst youth, is you're starting to see a transition in Sharia scholars away from those who used to dominate perhaps the scholarship, both from an academic, but also from a practical financial services sector perspective 5 or 10 years ago, to, again, we're starting to see 20, 30, 40-year-old Sharia scholars now taking the helm at both, large financial institutions, producing a lot of scholarship on their own around, again, the impact space where, that identity and sense of, again, a positive screen is part of their philosophy. So that's where we're starting to see the shift. But again, from a de jure perspective, that scholar is necessary, but can at times be a roadblock to progress.
Great, thank you. And John, I'd also like to ask you, there's a lot that the Jewish community, I think, we can learn from the Catholic community, but there are also some differences. And one of the major ones being that there is a Pope in the Catholic community who has been very vocal, even the quote you shared at the beginning, who has been very vocal in support of, like you mentioned, of impact investing. So how does that play out in the Catholic community? There's both sort of the top-down interest and support, but there also still is some amount of community organizing you've had to do. How does that balance look?
Well, it's developing, and it almost day to day. It seems almost as if there is really strong leadership obviously at the head of the church with the Pope, and movement a little bit further down. I would say that clergy, particularly within the U.S. and U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, have not taken the lead in terms of impact investing. It is understood that they're working on the guidelines that they put out, and it's likely to be quite a bit more expansive, and that's good news. But it is a process. I think it's very similar to what I heard in the early session, the first session, was there are those who are very hesitant, sort of, I think Julie said it, death by investment committee, and that happens, to be sure, is what we're seeing. But younger people are very enthused. I heard Kavi say this very thing, and starting to move the conversation, as well as those who are a bit more bold. And I heard Charlene say, I loved your attitude of boldness that she spoke about with the foundation there. And I think And with the pledge, I think what will be happening here is that more and more will be moving into this, more and more visibility around it. And it'll be a sense that you're sort of being left behind if you're sticking with sort of the old, well, we've got to maximize our returns and minimize risk so that we can give it to our universities so they can spend it on their mission. It's much of a broader view, which is certainly what, as you say, the Pope is really laying out and beginning to merge.
Great, thank you, John. And I'm noticing from everybody's comments, and this is certainly true in the Jewish community, that as the world changes and as the impact investing arena, a responsible investing arena continues to grow and continues to be more popular in the broader world, institutions find pressure, including from younger folks, to engage more, to consider this more, to really bring this in to as a core part of our institution's work. So Nana, I'd like to turn the same question to you about what do you see across your network? And I'll just add that from a Jewish community perspective, you know, it's very decentralized, as Julie noted. There are lots of different institutions and organizations. It's sort of the opposite of a Pope model. And so how does that look when you look at other faith communities? And how does that, you know, I imagine that poses somewhat of a challenge when you're attempting to build collaborations among faiths. How do you bridge that all together?
I mean, it's an interesting question for us because it's almost coming from both sides, in the sense that you do have the need for the faith leaders to take the lead and to almost make it easier for the investment committees and all of the governance and guidance, etc., to follow along. There are many people who would like to do more. That's what we find with the people who are our members, the asset owners, but they need to have that support and almost that barrier to any shakiness, because it's not easy to transition. It's not easy to change the way an organization invests. And it's not easy to stick with it whilst you're learning how to do it effectively and whilst you're taking a different kind of risk return, volatility, whatever, over a different time horizon as you think about moving to impact. But what's interesting that almost you're finding the faith leaders are being encouraged to think this way, because some of the secular organizations are saying, well, can't the faiths take a lead in this current environment? We've been struggling with these things. We haven't been making a difference. So when I mentioned the climate investment funds earlier, the World Bank, they actually saw myself and Martin in the conference and they came to us and said, interesting, maybe we can work with the faiths collaboratively. Having other conversations like that, which in a sense is forcing the faith leaders to take the lead because there's not just a cry from their own congregations, their own laity, there's a cry from the broader world. And I think that's made it very easy for us in a sense to start the conversation. Moving the conversation forward is another thing. But at least on the ultimate objective, we can probably agree, and then the steps is where the hard work begins.
Great, and let's also transition now to, you know, obviously it's on everybody's mind, the current environment we find ourselves in across the world, the coronavirus pandemic. The last panel touched a little bit from Jewish communal perspective about what Jewish institutions are doing in response and how is that affecting the progress of adopting responsible investing. But I'd love to ask you all that question. And to start with you, Nana, you know, has coronavirus affected the trajectory of faith consistent investing, and has it affected the trajectory of multi-faith collaboration?
So in terms of pure faith consistent investing, you kind of have those who have to manage the money day to day, who really have to make the returns, who are still very much on the old returns only model of fiduciary duty, have in a sense said, we know we need to do this. We need to think how to do this. We're seeing some evidence that actually being faith consistent might be a better strategy, even from a financial perspective, but we're going to take some time to move ourselves there. So what we've actually seen is that this crisis has almost accelerated the movement side, accelerated the big voice, accelerated the big vision, whilst the implementers are struggling to catch up with the sense that society actually needs to look at things differently and do things differently. So it's galvanized and made it easier to have big picture conversations with many faiths, but it's also, you're finding the individual organizations are struggling to figure out how to manage all of the different pulls and ties that are on them right now. It's a challenging time for many.
Great, and John, I'd love to ask you that same question, especially since the pledge was launched, you know, less than a year ago, and it's had tremendous traction. What are the conversations looking like within the Catholic community? Does it seem like things are on hold? Does it seem like things are more important than ever?
I don't know. It's the truth. Uh, I know a lot of groups, including us and others, and we rely 88% of our revenue to cover is required to cover the cost from investment earnings to cover the cost of our sisters. So we're a little shell shocked, as most were, when we saw these deep dives, including the bond market for a time. And so we sort of, I think many of us are sort of getting the handle on where is this going. But it hasn't varied our approach because our track record shows since going to impact investing, we've improved our risk return profile. We've reduced our risk. And this is where I think we want to be able to more examples of groups that can explain how did that work and not just say we've done better. I could describe in more detail how that worked for those that want to understand that. So I don't know yet. I think we're still trying to hear from people, and that's part of the process we're in right now.
Great. Thank you, John. It's definitely a time of uncertainty. And Kavi, I'd love to hear what you're seeing across the Muslim world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nana and John both hit the nail on the head with their comments. Nana, when she said, faith consistency may be a better strategy, and John, when he said, you're sort of seeing improvements in your risk return profile based on the current allocation. And so when we look at kind of at the span of Islamic finance assets or investment assets, I think you'd see something very similar. We're not necessarily seeing money flowing out of them into conventional or away from impact-oriented investments. That being said, back in about 2 or 3 years ago, we put out an academic paper we did with some colleagues at University of Udine, where we looked at the performance of public equities, the Dow Jones and the S&P and some of the FTSE equities, and we compared their conventional to their SRI to their Islamic sub-indices and looked at their performance. And the bottom line was there are diversification benefits to a portfolio to be exposed across all three. And so I think what's going to be interesting is maybe in a couple of years, once the data is there, to kind of look back and see how impact investing, faith-based oriented funds or investors performed relative to their benchmarks or relative to the peers that excluded those kind of positive benefits. And I think, again, that helps to strengthen the kind of anecdotal sense we have, at least initially, or individual portfolio sense that, there may be better performance, to kind of look at the aggregate data to say, yep, this is a valuable hypothesis. They are the return and or portfolio diversification benefits. And that really then starts to mobilize the assets into the space.
Great. Thank you all. So I'd like to ask a final round of questions, which is really about advice for the Jewish community. As Julie noted, this summit is focused on transitioning conversation in the Jewish community from the why to the how. And institutions are at different stages, but there's a lot to learn from across the faiths. So do you have any pieces of wisdom or advice, any obstacles overcome that you would share, words of encouragement that you would share with a Jewish institution or a Jewish organization or a Jewish individual who is starting along the road to values-aligned investing, faith-consistent investing? Let's start with John and then Kavi and Nana.
Absolutely. So I've heard a few other things. I love what the other panel suggested. I'm totally in agreement with what they were saying. Perfect not to be the enemy of the good. The one thing I would say that maybe is a little different is that at Seek, we have made a central pillar that we leave room for the Holy Spirit to move. So to actually seek the Lord's guidance in these things, to me, has made a huge difference. If we rely on our own gifting, our own skills, our own smarts, we're going to fall short. It will not be what it could be and what it should be. So I would suggest that is something that take your faith seriously in this and live it in your investment process.
Yeah, I love that answer. And it speaks to me also as a rabbi and sort of thinking about the thousands of years of wisdom and values and embedded in Jewish tradition and how that all actually speaks very directly to the modern questions of responsible investing, and that how we can pull that right out, and it can be really meaningful and inspiring. So I appreciate that. And Kavi, let's turn to you as well.
Yeah, and maybe, you know, I really appreciate what John said, and that would be the same. And maybe I'll add on how, you know, within the context of Islamic investing and Islamic impact investing in particular, you know, as I talked about, you've got the maqasid al-sharia, but then it needs to be operationalized, right? You've got these religious texts in the body of religious knowledge that then you need to operationalize within the context of modern financial investment and modern finance, right? So how do you, I guess the next step is really to think about processes of integrating and applying those texts to actual activities that then drive both attitude, behaviors, processes, operations within, you know, financial services organizations. And that's where we've been able to do quite a bit of work on, again, taking the higher level text and distilling them into what do they mean in terms of organizational culture within an entity, and then kind of your process, your procedures, your policies, et cetera, to really actualize that text into, you know, life action within an investment context.
Yeah, that's a really important point. That's a really important step. And Nana, do you have any advice for the Jewish community, speaking from a multi-faith perspective?
I would. So just two things I would say. One, very much start from your values, start from your beliefs. You will, having that foundation, not only to help you do no harm, but also to actively identify what good you want to do, is very strong, and it will help you throughout your journey in faith consistent investing. And the other thing is work with peers. I mean, the whole reason why FaithInvest was set up was to create a network of peers. So yes, you can have experts coming in who can give you some of the theory, but also talk with your peers, some of those who have gone along the journey, to give you some of the practice. And that's the only way you get the confidence to take the next step.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's very much JLens's mission and goal as well, is that we want to build this community, build this network, advance Jewish leadership in this arena, serve as a resource to institutions who are thinking about values and what are the organization's values and how do we bring those into an investment portfolio. So those are all really important questions and really valuable questions to be asking. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you all for being here, for taking the time in the midst of everything that's going on. And I'll just add, so the next session coming up in about 10 minutes is grants versus loans, how Jewish organizations can explore impact investments. Stay tuned, and we'll have a full day also tomorrow, three full hours from 12 to 3 Eastern tomorrow. So please tune in with us then. Thank you all.